A single father bought a rusted-out car for $100 while his neighbors laughed and called it the dumbest decision he had ever made. 5 days later, a billionaire from the world of professional racing pulled into his driveway holding a check for $5 million. What could possibly be hidden beneath a layer of rust that looked worth nothing? And why was Lucas Hayes a quiet mechanic drowning in hospital debt? The only man on that entire block who saw what everyone else had walked past for half a century. The house on Rosewood Lane had not been painted in 6 years. Lucas Hayes remembered the summer he had planned to do it, the summer Claire had still been well enough to sit on the porch and pick the color. She had wanted a soft gray. The cans were still stacked in the garage, their lids sealed by time, and the kind of grief that makes small tasks feel impossible. He worked out of that garage fixing engines for neighbors and strangers who found his number on a bulletin board at the hardware store. The money came in uneven bursts, never quite enough to catch up on the hospital bills that kept arriving from 3 different billing departments. Wyatt, his son, was 20 and worked part-time at an auto parts counter across town. They had an understanding about certain things. Silence between them was the shape of what they had survived together. The stuffed bear Claire had given Wyatt the year she was first diagnosed still sat on the bookshelf in the living room. She had named it Bolt, after the lightning bolt stitched on its chest. Lucas rarely spoke of Claire out loud anymore. The bear did the remembering for both of them, and that was enough. On a Tuesday morning in early October, Lucas drove out to Kessler's salvage yard on the east edge of town, looking for a transmission he could rebuild and resell. The yard stretched across 4 acres of flattened weeds and rusted hulks. He wandered past the usual rows and stopped at the back corner where the forgotten things went to disappear. The car was under a blue tarp so faded it had gone almost white. He only noticed it because the wind had lifted one corner and exposed a fender with an unusual curve, something machined rather than stamped. Lucas pulled the tarp back and stared at what was underneath. A low, long coupe, the color of dried blood under all the rust, with a long hood and fender vents he did not recognize from any production catalog he had ever studied. The body lines were wrong for any factory car. Someone had built this by hand. Old Kessler came walking over with a paper cup of sunflower seeds in one hand. He said he had hauled the car off a property auction 11 years ago and never found a buyer. No title, no paperwork, engine seized. He said Lucas could have it for $100 if he took it away today, because he needed the space for a shipment of scrap coming Friday. Lucas walked around the car twice before he answered. He did not know what he was looking at. He only knew that whoever had shaped the aluminum under that rust had known exactly what they were doing. He counted out 520s from his wallet. It was the grocery money for the next 2 weeks, and part of what he had set aside for the electric bill. Kessler wrote him a handwritten receipt on the back of a parts slip, and Lucas tucked it into the glove box of his truck as though it might matter later. Rosewood Lane had opinions about everything, and the arrival of a rusted wreck on a Tuesday afternoon was not going to pass unnoticed. By the time he backed the borrowed trailer into his driveway, 3 neighbors were standing on their lawns with their arms folded. Diana Keller came out of the white 2-story across the street, wearing the kind of practiced smile that was not really a smile at all. She lived there with her husband, behind a trimmed boxwood hedge, and she had a way of appearing at every inconvenient moment, as if monitoring property values were a civic duty the rest of them had neglected. She walked across the street with her arms folded and stopped at the edge of his driveway. Her eyes moved over the coupe, slowly taking inventory of every patch of rust, every missing piece of chrome. Then she looked at Lucas and let out a short laugh that was meant to be heard by the neighbors on either side. She asked him how much he had paid for it. When he told her, she repeated the number back to him like he had misspoken. $100, she said, shaking her head. Even that was too much because now he was going to have to pay someone to haul it back out. Lucas did not answer her. He climbed up onto the trailer and began unhooking the chains. She stood there another moment, then said loud enough for the whole block that some men just did not know when to stop embarrassing themselves and that it was a shame Wyatt had to grow up watching his father make decisions like this. Then she turned on her heel and walked back across the street, her shoulders squared, like a woman who had just performed a public service. Lucas kept working. He had heard worse from her specifically. What bothered him was not the insult. It was that he could not explain even to himself why he had bought the car. He only knew that something in the shape of it had felt familiar, the way a melody can stop a man in a crowded room without him understanding why. Wyatt came home from work just as the sun was dropping behind the roofline. He stood in the driveway with his keys still in his hand, looking at the coupe for a long time. Then he asked his father a single question. He asked whether the car had a name yet. Lucas shook his head. Wyatt walked around at once, touched the rusted fender with the flat of his palm, and said it looked like a bolt to him, like the old bear, like something that had been sitting still for a long time, but still remembered how to move fast. Lucas laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. They pushed the car off the trailer together, rolling it into the garage on soft tires, and Lucas closed the door behind them. Under the single bulb overhead, he ran his hand along the driver's side door and felt something he had not expected. A seam where the aluminum had been hand-rolled and welded almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Production cars did not have seams like that. Prototype cars did. He crouched beside the engine bay that night with a flashlight, and the more he saw, the less sense it made. The chassis number stamped into the frame rail did not match any format he recognized from the 1960s or 70s. The suspension mounts were custom fabricated. The firewall had been formed from a single sheet of aluminum, rather than stamped in two halves, like every factory car he had ever worked on. Someone had built this car for a purpose, and then it had disappeared into a salvage yard for more than a decade. He sat on an overturned milk crate and stared at the car for a long time. The electric bill was due in 6 days. He had spent part of the money to get here, and he did not know yet whether he had made a mistake or found something no one else had been willing to see. He decided he was going to find out. Wednesday morning arrived with a low gray sky and damp air that made the rust on the coupe look darker than it had the night before. Lucas was in the garage before sunrise, a mug of black coffee cooling on the workbench beside him. The chassis number kept running through his head in a loop, 5 digits and 2 letters that belonged to no database he had ever searched. He started with the engine bay. The block was seized, as Kessler had said, but when Lucas wiped the grease and dust away from the valve cover, he saw something that stopped his hand. A small maker's mark stamped into the aluminum near the oil filler neck, no larger than a thumbnail. The shape of a hawk, with its wings folded, and beneath it, 2 letters, M and W. The mark was too precise to be factory work. Whoever had pressed it into the metal had signed the engine the way an artist signs a canvas. Wyatt came down around 7 with toast in one hand and his work shirt unbuttoned. He stood in the doorway watching his father for a while before asking what had been found. Lucas did not look up from the engine. He said only that the car had been built by someone who left fingerprints and that he was going to spend the day trying to figure out whose fingerprints they were. Wyatt nodded and said he would stop by the library on the way home from work and pull anything he could find on custom coach builders from the 1960s and 70s. By the afternoon, Lucas had taken photographs of everything: the hand-rolled door seams, the custom suspension mounts, the aluminum firewall, the hawk mark, the strange chassis number on the frame rail. He uploaded the images to a restoration forum he had used for years, a place where old mechanics and amateur historians argued about carburetors and original paint codes. He posted under the handle he had used for a decade and titled the thread simply, "Unidentified coupe possible prototype. Need help." He refreshed the page every hour while he worked. By the time Wyatt came home with a stack of library photocopies, there were 3 replies on the thread. The first 2 were the usual noise guesses about kit cars and replicas. The third was different. It was a single sentence from a user Lucas had never interacted with before. The sentence read, "Take that post down before the wrong people see it." The account had been created 6 years ago and had posted exactly 4 times all of them on threads about lost prototype vehicles from the 1960s. Lucas sent the user a private message asking what he was supposed to be afraid of. The reply came back within 20 minutes. The user wrote that the Hawk Mark belonged to a coach builder named Marcus Webb, that Marcus Webb had built exactly 11 prototype racing coupes between 1966 and 1972, and that every single one of those cars had been documented as destroyed in a warehouse fire in the spring of 1973. The user wrote that certain people had spent a very long time making sure the official history stayed the way it was, and that those people did not like being reminded it was wrong. Lucas closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light. Wyatt was spreading the library photocopies across the wood, and he slid one of the pages across to his father without speaking. A grainy black and white photograph from a magazine article dated 1971. A tall man in a mechanic's shirt stood beside a low coupe with a long hood and fender vents. The caption underneath read, "Marcus Webb," with the 4th of his prototype series. Chassis designation W004. Lucas stood up and walked into the garage without speaking. He took the flashlight down from the pegboard and crouched beside the frame rail. He wiped the metal clean with a shop rag and shined the light across the stamped characters. The chassis number on the frame read W004. Thursday was the day the neighborhood began to notice that something had changed. Lucas had not meant for it to happen. He had not spoken to anyone about what he had found. But the thread on the restoration forum had been screenshotted and shared to a larger enthusiast group overnight, and by Thursday morning, the photographs of the Hawk Mark and the chassis number were circulating on 3 different collector websites. His phone began ringing at 9 in the morning and didn't stop. The first call was from a dealer in Arizona who offered him $50,000 sight unseen. The second was from a broker in Florida who offered $75,000. The third was from a woman in Michigan who claimed to represent a private museum and would not give her name. By noon, a panel van with out-of-state plates had driven slowly past the house twice. A man with a camera had taken photographs of the driveway from the sidewalk before Lucas came out and told him to leave. The garage door stayed closed. The coupe stayed inside. Diana Keller noticed all of it. She stood in her front window behind the curtain and watched the strangers come and go, and by Thursday afternoon, she had walked across the street in a cream-colored blouse she did not normally wear on weekdays. She knocked on the front door with a plate of lemon bars and a smile that was almost, but not quite convincing. Lucas answered and did not invite her in. She stood on the porch and told him she had been thinking, and that perhaps she had been too quick to judge the other day, and that a man with his talents deserved more credit than the neighborhood had given him. She added that her brother-in-law had some experience with collector cars and would be happy to come by and give Lucas some advice free of charge. Lucas thanked her for the lemon bars and said only that he was still figuring out what he had. He closed the door politely and set the plate on the counter. He did not eat any of them. The squad car pulled up at 7 that evening. 2 officers, polite but firm, asked whether Lucas could produce proof of ownership for the vehicle in his garage. An anonymous call had come in suggesting the car might be stolen property. Lucas showed them the handwritten receipt from Kessler's salvage yard and the photographs he had taken of the empty numbered lot where the car had been sitting. The officers apologized for the inconvenience, made a note, and left. Lucas stood in his driveway and watched them go. He did not need to ask who had made the call. He could see the curtain in the white 2-story shift back into place from across the street. Friday morning, he woke before dawn. He sat in the kitchen in the dark and thought about Claire. He thought about the last conversation they had ever had 3 days before the end, when she had told him that the best thing about him was that he looked at things other people threw away and saw what they were really worth. She had said it with her eyes closed, almost too quiet to hear. He had carried that sentence for 3 years without knowing what to do with it. He understood now. He had bought the coupe because some part of him had already known, not the specifics, not the name Marcus Webb, but the shape of the thing, the sense that a life's work had been buried under rust and silence, and that someone was going to have to be the one to pull it back into the light. Wyatt came home from work that evening visibly uneasy. He had been approached at the parts counter by a man in an expensive jacket who had asked very specific questions about his father's latest project. The man had not bought anything. He had simply stood at the counter, asked the questions, and left. Wyatt described him carefully on the back of a receipt. A tall man graying at the temples, silver watch. A voice that was polite in a way that did not feel polite at all. Lucas folded the receipt and put it in his wallet. He told Wyatt to keep his phone on him at all times. Then he went out to the garage and spent 2 hours reinforcing the side door with a second deadbolt and a length of 2x4 braced against the frame. For the first time since he had brought the car home, he understood that what was sitting in his garage was no longer just a machine. It was a problem that other people were going to try to solve for him, whether he wanted their help or not. The private message from the forum user came in at 4 in the afternoon. The message was shorter this time. It read, "A man will come to your house tonight. He is not the owner. He represents the people who arranged the fire in 1973. Do not sign anything. Do not take his offer. The real owner will come tomorrow." Lucas wrote back, asking who the user was. The reply came after a long delay. It read only someone who worked for Marcus Webb and who watched the warehouse burn. "I have been waiting 30 years for someone to find what you found." Lucas closed the laptop and did not open it again. The dark car that pulled into his driveway at 8 that evening was not a vehicle he recognized. A driver got out first, then a tall man in a charcoal suit, graying at the temples, a silver watch catching the street light. Wyatt looked at his father from the kitchen window and did not need to say anything. It was the same man from the parts counter. The man introduced himself as Richard Mercer. He said he represented a consortium of private collectors and had come to make Lucas a serious offer before the situation became more complicated than it needed to be. He spoke from the bottom of the porch steps. He did not ask to come inside. He said his clients were prepared to pay $200,000 in cash that evening for the car in the garage. He said the coupe had no provable provenance, no title, no documentation, and that anyone who bought it on the open market would be taking a significant legal risk. He said it would be wiser for Lucas to accept a clean offer from buyers who understood the car's history. Lucas asked him what history that was. Mercer smiled without warmth and said that cars like this one had a way of disappearing before their new owners could enjoy them. He said it would be a shame if something happened before Lucas had a chance to put the money to use. He said the offer was good only for that night. Lucas told him to leave. Mercer looked at him for a long moment without answering. Then he set a business card on the porch rail, a card with a phone number and no name and no company printed on it. He said Lucas had until morning. He walked back to the car and the car pulled away, and the street was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Wyatt came out onto the porch behind his father without speaking. The two of them stood in the cold air for a long time, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. That whoever Richard Mercer actually worked for had known where Lucas lived, had known Wyatt's name had stood at a parts counter 30 miles away asking questions. That the men who had arranged a fire in a warehouse 50 years ago were still paying attention. That the car in the garage had pulled something into the daylight that was never meant to be seen again. Lucas did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a shotgun borrowed from a cousin across the river, resting on the chair beside him, and he watched the driveway through the window until the sun came up. Saturday morning, another message from the forum user was waiting for him. It read, "The real owner is coming today. His name is Dominic Ashford. Hear him out. Then decide." The dark sedan that pulled up at 3 in the afternoon was a different car entirely, and the man who stepped out of it was older than Mercer by a decade, slower, quieter, with the kind of bearing that came from decades of being listened to without having to raise his voice. He wore a charcoal coat over a dark sweater. He walked up the driveway alone and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, waiting to be invited up. He said his name was Dominic Ashford. He said he had driven a long way, and he asked whether Lucas would be willing to give him a few minutes. They sat at the kitchen table. Wyatt made coffee, and then left the room understanding without being told that this was a conversation that needed fewer people in it, not more. Dominic wrapped both hands around the mug and did not drink from it. He said he had spent more than 30 years looking for a car that everyone in the world believed had burned in a warehouse in the spring of 1973. He said he had been the one who commissioned it. He said Marcus Webb had been his closest friend, and that the two of them had built 11 prototypes together before Marcus died, 3 months after the fire of a heart attack that Dominic had always suspected was not entirely natural. Lucas asked him why the cars had been destroyed. Dominic set the mug down carefully. He said the prototypes had been developed in secret for a racing program that had made certain powerful people nervous. The technology inside the cars had been 20 years ahead of what the established teams were using, and those teams had friends in places where friends mattered. The fire had not been an accident. Dominic had spent the rest of his life making sure the memory of Marcus's work was protected, even when the work itself was gone. He looked up. He said a man named Richard Mercer had almost certainly been to the house already. Lucas did not answer. Dominic nodded once and said that Mercer worked for the same consortium that had arranged the fire. They were older men now, most of them, but they had sons and lawyers and long memories, and they had never stopped wanting the prototypes erased from the historical record. He said Lucas would not hear from Mercer again. He would see to that personally, and he had the relationships to make it stick. He said he wanted to see the car. Lucas stood up and led him out to the garage. Dominic walked around the coupe twice without speaking, touching nothing, taking in every detail the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he lost a long time ago. When he came back around to the front, his eyes were wet, but his voice did not change. He said that this was the 4th of the 11 prototypes. He said that the last time he had seen it, it had been in a warehouse in Pennsylvania in January of 1973, and that Marcus had been alive and standing beside it. Then he told Lucas that he wanted to buy the car. He said he would pay $5 million for it. The check could be written that night, and the transfer completed within the week. He said Lucas should take a day to think about it, but that the offer was firm and would not be repeated. Lucas did not answer immediately. He walked around the coupe once himself, his hand trailing along the rusted fender. He thought about the shoebox on top of the refrigerator and the gray paint in the garage that had never been opened. He thought about Wyatt, who had named the car Bolt, without knowing any of this, and who was waiting in the house right now, pretending not to listen through the kitchen window. He told Dominic he would think about it. Dominic nodded once. He left a business card on the workbench with a single phone number on it. Then he walked back to the sedan, and it pulled away from the curb, and the street was quiet again. Lucas did not sleep that night either. He sat at the kitchen table long after Wyatt had gone upstairs, the business card in front of him. The shoebox of hospital bills came down from the refrigerator for the first time in almost a year. 3 billing departments, a collections, notice a letter from a credit card company he had stopped opening months ago. The total, when he ran the numbers on a napkin, came to just over $84,000. $5 million was a number that did not fit inside the kitchen. He thought about it for a long time, and what surprised him was that the money itself was not the hardest part of the decision. The hardest part was quieter. It was the question of what the car was and what it would mean to let it go. He thought about Marcus Webb, a man he had never met whose hands had shaped the aluminum under the rust with a care that could still be felt 50 years later. He thought about Dominic Ashford, who had spent 3 decades believing a friend's life work was ashes. He thought about the user on the forum, the one who had watched the warehouse burn, and had been carrying that silence ever since. The car in his garage did not belong to any of them individually. It belonged to a chapter of history that had been deliberately erased, and he was for reasons he did not fully understand the one holding the only copy. He thought about Claire. She had not been talking about cars when she said what she said. She had been talking about the way he moved through the world. And if there was a version of himself he wanted Wyatt to remember, it was not the version with $5 million in the bank and a quiet conscience. It was the version that made the right kind of decision in a kitchen before sunrise, with only a shoebox and a napkin for company. He did not want to keep the car. He had known that from the moment Dominic had said the name Marcus Webb out loud. The car was not meant to live in a suburban garage. It was meant to be seen. The only question was how to let it go without letting the story go with it. By the time the sun came up on Sunday, he had made his decision. He wrote it down on the back of the napkin in small, careful handwriting, so he would not lose the shape of what he wanted when the conversation happened. He called Dominic Ashford at 10 in the morning. Lucas said he was prepared to sell the car, but not on the terms Dominic had laid out. He said there were conditions. Dominic asked him what they were. Lucas read them from the napkin. The first was that the car could not disappear into a private collection. It had to be placed in a public museum with accompanying documentation where anyone who wanted to see it could walk in and see it. The second was that Marcus Webb's name had to appear on the display prominently, along with the true story of the prototype program and the fire in 1973. The third was that the exhibit had to be written in language a person with no engineering background could understand, because the point was not to impress specialists, but to honor a man whose work had been hidden from ordinary people for half a century. The fourth was that the plaque on the car had to acknowledge that the coupe had been given the name Bolt by Wyatt Hayes, who had named it before anyone knew what it was. The line was quiet for a long moment after Lucas finished. Then Dominic asked, in a voice that had gone slightly unsteady, who Wyatt was. Lucas told him. Dominic said that Marcus had named every one of his cars, too. Sometimes the name came to you before the thing was finished, and that was how you knew you had built something honest. He said he accepted every condition. He said he would have his lawyer draft the agreement that afternoon, and that the purchase would be structured as a transfer to a non-profit foundation. He would fund specifically created to preserve Marcus Webb's work. He said the museum placement would be permanent, not a loan. He said Lucas would be credited as the man who had recovered the car if he wanted the credit, and anonymous if he did not. Lucas said he would prefer anonymity. Dominic said he understood. The paperwork was signed on Monday afternoon in Lucas's kitchen, with Dominic's lawyer present, and Wyatt standing quietly by the window. The check was handed across the table in a plain white envelope. Lucas opened it, once looked at the number, and set it beside the bills he was finally going to be able to pay. The coupe left Rosewood Lane on Wednesday morning on a covered transport trailer, and the neighborhood watched it go the same way they had watched it arrive, except this time no one laughed. Richard Mercer never called again. Whatever Dominic had done in the days after their meeting had been enough. No panel vans came down the street. No photographers stood at the sidewalk. The silence that settled over the house was the first clean silence Lucas could remember in a long time. Diana Keller was not on her front porch when the trailer pulled away. The story of the car's real value had traveled the neighborhood by then, and so had the story of the anonymous call to the police. The neighbors had done their own arithmetic. Diana called Lucas twice that week to suggest lunch. He did not return the calls. Within 3 weeks, a listing sign went up in her front yard. She and her husband moved out before the end of the following month. No one on Rosewood Lane asked too many questions about the timing. Lucas paid off the hospital debts first. All 3 billing departments, the collections notice, the credit card company. He kept the receipts in a new folder, and he put the old shoebox in the recycling bin the day the last check cleared. He bought the gray paint off the shelf in the garage and finally painted the house 6 years after Claire had picked the color. It took him and Wyatt 2 weekends. When they were done, he stood on the lawn and looked up at it, and could not, for a long moment, remember what it had looked like before. He did not change his work. He still fixed engines out of the garage, still took calls from the bulletin board at the hardware store, still charged the same rates he had always charged. The money from the sale sat in an account he barely touched, most of it placed in a trust that would go to Wyatt, and to a scholarship fund Lucas had set up in Claire's name for nursing students at the local community college. She had wanted to go back to school the year she was diagnosed and had never gotten the chance. He wanted the money to do something, and he did not want it to change who he was. Those were two separate problems, and he solved them in separate ways. Wyatt stepped back from the parts counter and enrolled in an engineering program at the State University that fall. He drove the same truck he had always driven. The stuffed bear stayed on the shelf in the living room. The name Bolt, which he had given to a rusted coupe on a Tuesday afternoon in his father's driveway, now appeared on a small brass plaque at an automotive museum in Pennsylvania beneath a black and white photograph of Marcus Webb. Wyatt went to see it once alone. The week the exhibit opened. He had not told his father he was going. When he came home, he only said that it looked good, that the writing on the plaque was clear, and that an older couple had been standing in front of the car, reading every word. Lucas nodded and did not ask for more detail. The coupe sat in that museum now, under careful lighting behind a low rope barrier, with its hand-rolled seams and its hawk mark, and the chassis number W004 visible through a cutaway panel that had been added so visitors could see the craftsmanship underneath. The plaque on the wall told the full story. Marcus Webb, the prototype program, the fire in the spring of 1973, the 30 years of silence, the rediscovery on a salvage lot in a small American town, the name given to the car before anyone knew what it was. Every condition Lucas had written on the back of a napkin had been honored exactly as he had asked. He did not go to see it himself, not yet. He would someday. For now, it was enough to know that it was there that the story had survived, that a man's work had been pulled back into the light by someone who had not been looking for anything except a transmission he could rebuild and resell. The real value had never been in the car. It had been in the willingness to see what everyone else had walked past. That was a thing no check could ever have bought from him. It was the one part of himself he had managed to keep.